On a cold March day in 1943, in a wood-panelled office tucked deep within Berlin's maze of military command, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris held a piece of paper that contained a death sentence. Not his own, though, that would come soon enough, but the death sentence of the Third Reich itself. The report was a single sheet, a distilled summary of raw intelligence gathered by German agents operating in neutral countries thousands of miles away. Its contents were so staggering, so impossible, that when presented to the highest levels of Nazi leadership, it was met not with alarm, but with laughter. The document didn't describe a secret weapon, a massive Allied army, or a brilliant new tactical innovation. It described something far more terrifying to those who understood the arithmetic of modern warfare. A factory. An American factory in Michigan called Willow Run, operated by the Ford Motor Company, projected to produce a 4-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every single hour. To the fanatical minds of the Nazi high command, this was absurd. It had to be American propaganda, an intelligence plant designed to demoralize Germany. But to the professional intelligence officers of the Abwehr who risked their lives to gather this information, to men like Canaris who understood that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in factories, it was something else entirely. It was mathematical proof that Germany had already lost World War II. The man who saw the future, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, was an anomaly in Hitler's inner circle. Unlike the ideological fanatics and sycophants who populated the Führer's headquarters, Canaris was an old-school professional, a career naval officer from a different era. As head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service since 1935, he was a man who lived and breathed facts, not fantasies. His duty was to provide the unvarnished truth to Germany's military leadership, no matter how unpalatable that truth might be. In the early years of the war, the Abwehr had been instrumental in Germany's stunning victories. The intelligence his organization provided enabled the Wehrmacht to outmaneuver opponents during the Blitzkrieg campaigns. But by early 1943, everything was changing. The disaster at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of German invincibility. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was grinding westward with terrifying momentum. In North Africa, Rommel's once legendary Afrika Korps was being systematically destroyed by American and British forces. Yet even as reality closed in around them, Hitler and his inner circle remained dangerously detached. Surrounded by yes-men who filtered out bad news and reinforced delusions, the Führer believed that victory was simply a matter of will. German soldiers were superior. German science was unbeatable. Germany would triumph because destiny demanded it. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Canaris was about to pour a bucket of ice-cold reality. The intelligence that couldn't be believed. The information didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it accumulated slowly, a creeping dread built from dozens of sources across neutral countries. A Swedish engineer who had toured American factories before the war sent detailed technical reports. Portuguese merchants reported on the scale of American shipping observed in Atlantic ports. Swiss businessmen with commercial relationships in the United States forwarded production statistics from annual reports. Spanish diplomats in Washington mailed American newspapers that brazenly published manufacturing figures, something that would be unthinkable in Germany, where production numbers were state secrets. The intelligence painted a picture that seemed to defy the laws of physics and economics. The reports all converged on a single, impossible claim. Ford Motor Company had built a factory in Michigan capable of mass-producing B-24 Liberator heavy bombers using automobile assembly line techniques. Not one bomber per day. Not one every few hours. One bomber every single hour, operating around the clock. The German analysts did the mathematics. If the Americans could actually achieve this production rate, it meant 24 bombers per day. Over 700 bombers per month. From a single factory. At the time, Germany's entire aircraft industry was struggling to produce a fraction of that number in heavy bombers. To understand why this seemed impossible, one must grasp the complexity of a B-24 Liberator. This wasn't a simple machine. It was an 18-ton behemoth of aluminum and steel, stretching 67 feet long with a 110-foot wingspan. Each aircraft contained 150,000 individual parts, more than 100 times the components in an automobile. Every bomber required 360,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. German factories, considered the pinnacle of European engineering, took weeks or even months to produce comparable heavy bombers, like the Heinkel He 177. The factory that defied imagination. Half a world away from Berlin's disbelief, the impossible was becoming very real. On a former stretch of farmland in Ypsilanti, Michigan, a monster had risen from the prairie. The Willow Run bomber plant was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Designed by the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn, the same man who had revolutionized factory design for Ford. The main building was a single room so vast it earned the title of the most enormous room in the history of man. The factory stretched for more than 3,200 feet, over half a mile, and encompassed 3.5 million square feet under one roof. To put this in perspective, the entire complex was larger than some German aircraft manufacturers' combined facilities. Construction had begun on April 18, 1941, when the United States wasn't even in the war yet. The first B-24 rolled off the assembly line on September 10, 1942, just under 18 months later. But early production was slow and plagued with problems, earning the plant the sardonic nickname, "Will it run?" among skeptics. The real revolution was in the philosophy. Henry Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, had visited Consolidated Aircraft's B-24 factory in San Diego in early 1941 and been horrified by the inefficiency. Workers assembled bombers outdoors on temporary jigs, spending hours on single components. Sorensen saw immediately that this complex aircraft could be broken down into manageable sub-assemblies, each built on specialized stations, while the main fuselage moved down a continuously moving assembly line, exactly like building Model T automobiles, but on a gargantuan scale. The assembly line featured an unusual 90-degree turn 2/3 of the way through production, the famous tax turn, where partially built bombers rotated on giant turntables. According to local legend, this bizarre feature was designed to keep the entire facility within a single county to minimize taxes, though it also prevented encroachment on the adjacent airfield's taxiways. The workers who proved ideology wrong. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Willow Run for Nazi ideology wasn't the factory itself, but who was building these bombers. At its peak, Willow Run employed 42,000 workers. Nearly 1/3 were women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who operated rivet guns and welding torches with skill that matched or exceeded their male counterparts. One of these women, Rose Will Monroe, became the real-life inspiration for the Rosie propaganda character after Hollywood actor Walter Pidgeon spotted her working as a riveter and cast her in a war bond film. Over 9% of the workforce was African American. Another 3% were classified as disabled. They worked side by side in 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week, their collective effort creating a relentless 24-hour industrial heartbeat. The factory's aircraft apprentice school trained up to 8,000 new workers per week, turning housewives, students, and people who had never touched a rivet gun into precision aircraft manufacturers. This was the mongrel society that Hitler loved to mock in his speeches, a diverse, democratic workforce of women, African Americans, immigrants, and people Nazi propaganda portrayed as racially inferior. Nazi ideology held that strength came from racial purity and authoritarian control. America had neither. Therefore, the intelligence reports had to be lies. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate. It meant that free people, united in common purpose, could achieve what totalitarian systems could not: the wall of denial. Presenting these facts to Nazi leadership was like trying to breach a fortress wall. The chief architect of German denial was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful man in Germany. A World War I flying ace who saw himself as the ultimate authority on air power, Göring was also profoundly corrupt and staggeringly egotistical. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings on Willow Run, Göring's reaction was contemptuous laughter. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he famously sneered to his staff. "They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." It was a perfect encapsulation of Nazi worldview. Americans were shopkeepers, a decadent consumer society, a mongrel race lacking the discipline and martial spirit of the German people. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce a heavy bomber was, in Göring's mind, simply impossible. Göring had political reasons for his denial beyond ideology. To accept Canaris's report would be a devastating admission that his own Luftwaffe intelligence had missed the most critical development of the war. It would mean his air force was about to be swept from the skies by an industrial avalanche he couldn't stop. The information was buried. Canaris was left holding a truth that could save Germany, but with no one in power willing to listen. The reckoning. The consequences of that willful blindness arrived first as a distant rumble, then as a terrifying roar that filled the skies over the Reich. Throughout late 1943, the trickle of American bombers became a flood. By 1944, Willow Run had solved its early production problems and hit full stride. In April 1944, the plant produced 428 B-24s, one complete bomber rolling off the line every 63 minutes. At its sustained peak, the factory was producing over 650 bombers monthly. These weren't propaganda numbers. They were real aircraft, flown by real crews, carrying real bombs. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week Operation Argument and All-Out Assault on German aircraft production. Nearly 4,000 American heavy bomber sorties struck targets across Germany, dropping over 18,000 tons of explosives. The United States lost 227 bombers and 42 fighters' terrible casualties, representing over 5,000 American dead or captured. But the Americans could replace those losses. Germany could not. Big Week cost the Luftwaffe a third of its available fighter aircraft, and more critically, nearly 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots, 14% of their fighter force. For every German fighter that went down, there was only a trickle of replacements. For every American bomber lost, 10 more were crossing the Atlantic. The mathematical certainty that Canaris had foreseen was now grinding Germany into dust. By 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, the final numbers told the story. Willow Run alone produced 6,972 complete B-24s plus 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Across all factories, the United States built over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. Total American aircraft production during the war exceeded 300,000 planes. Germany, in the same period, produced approximately 94,000 to 119,000 combat aircraft, less than a third of American output. In 1944 alone, American factories built 96,000 318 aircraft, while Germany managed 39,807. A single American factory had outproduced Germany's entire wartime heavy bomber program. The industrial shopkeepers had buried the master race under an avalanche of aluminum and steel. The price of truth. For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of delivering unwelcome facts was steep. As the war turned against Germany, his sober warnings marked him as unreliable in Hitler's paranoid court. To be a realist was to seem like a traitor. His rivals in the SS saw the Abwehr as a nest of defeatists lacking true Nazi fervour. But Canaris's opposition went deeper than delivering uncomfortable intelligence reports. Horrified by SS atrocities, he used the Abwehr to shield members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He secretly worked to prevent Spain from joining the Axis, an act of sabotage that cost Hitler dearly. The Abwehr became a centre for resistance activities, including Operation 7, which helped Jews escape Germany. In mid-February 1944, Canaris was removed from his position as head of the Abwehr. After the failed July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, the Gestapo investigation uncovered the vast network of opposition, and many trails led back to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries were discovered, revealing the true depth of his activities against the regime. On April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, the order came from a vengeful Hitler. At Flossenbürg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the man who had seen the future with perfect clarity, was slowly strangled to death with piano wire. He was executed alongside Dietrich Bonhoeffer, General Hans Oster, and other resistance members. It was a brutal, humiliating end for a man whose only crime was telling the truth. The legacy of denial. The story of March 17, 1943, and the intelligence report that was laughed out of Berlin's command rooms stands as one of history's most profound cautionary tales. It reveals that the most formidable walls aren't built of concrete and steel, but of ideology and willful ignorance. Germany wasn't defeated for lack of information. The spies did their jobs brilliantly. The intelligence was accurate. Germany was defeated because its leaders chose to trust their prejudices over facts, to believe their own propaganda over mathematical reality. They built a worldview on the quicksand of racial mythology, and when the tide of industrial arithmetic came crashing in, the entire structure was washed away. Willow Run stands as a monument to everything Nazism sought to destroy. The power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that totalitarianism could never match. That factory floor was a microcosm of the Allied cause, a chaotic, inefficient, beautiful mess of humanity that, when united in common purpose, achieved the impossible. The B-24 Liberators rolling off that assembly line every 63 minutes weren't just aircraft. They were democracy's answer to tyranny, each rivet driven by the free hands of people the Nazi regime had deemed inferior. In the end, those mongrels and shopkeepers proved that arithmetic trumps ideology, that production lines matter as much as front lines, and that truth, when ignored, exacts a terrible price.